Everyone in the hangar believed rank meant knowledge. The young officer shouted, confident that modern training and advanced systems made him superior. After all, this was a billion-dollar aircraft carrier, maintained by the best crew in the fleet. And yet, nothing worked. Alarms stayed silent. Screens refused to light up. The carrier was dead in the water. Then there was the old man. Wrinkled hands, calm eyes, a jacket that smelled of oil and decades of service. Most ignored him. Some laughed. One officer openly mocked him. How could you fix what we couldn't? But experience doesn't shout. It waits. When the veteran finally stepped forward, no one expected what happened next. One simple action, one forgotten detail, and suddenly the impossible became possible. This isn't just a story about machines. It's a story about pride, respect, and the dangerous mistake of underestimating those who came before us. The hangar was enormous, stretching like a steel cathedral beneath the aircraft carrier's deck. Rows of overhead lights cast sharp reflections across polished metal floors, illuminating the massive jet engine that sat silent at the center of the space. The engine alone was a monument to modern engineering, complex, powerful, and unforgiving. Around it stood the crew, young, highly trained, confident, and completely stuck. Lieutenant Harris paced back and forth, his white uniform crisp, his jaw clenched with frustration. He had been awake for nearly 20 hours, and every attempt to restart the carrier's auxiliary power systems had failed. Screens remained dark. Diagnostics returned errors that made no sense. Procedures were followed perfectly by the book. And yet, nothing worked. "This is impossible," Harris snapped, turning toward the engineers. "We've run every protocol twice." A junior technician swallowed nervously. "Sir, all readings indicate the system should be online." "Should doesn't fly a carrier," Harris shot back. Behind them, a small group of sailors stood quietly. No one wanted to speak. Every suggestion had already been dismissed. Every solution had failed. The pressure was building, not just from command but from pride. A modern carrier crippled on the inside was unthinkable. At the edge of the hangar, leaning casually against a railing, stood an old man. Most didn't notice him at first. He wore a faded brown leather jacket, creased from years of use. His cap bore an old naval insignia, one no longer issued. His hands rested calmly in his pockets, his eyes studying the engine not with confusion, but with familiarity. This was Walter Old Tim Collins, a retired carrier mechanic. 35 years of service, called in as a civilian consultant only because command insisted on all possible options. To most of the crew, he was a formality, a relic. Harris finally noticed him and frowned. "Who let him on the floor?" the lieutenant asked sharply. A petty officer hesitated. "Sir, he's the consultant." Harris scoffed. "Consultant? On this system?" The old man didn't react. He simply kept looking. Harris marched toward him, irritation boiling over. "With all due respect," he said, voice loud enough for everyone to hear, "we're dealing with next-generation systems. Digital control, integrated diagnostics. This isn't some old diesel engine." A few sailors exchanged glances. The tension was thick. Old Tim finally turned his head. His face was calm. No anger. No defensiveness. "I know," he said quietly. "I helped install the first version of it." A ripple of disbelief moved through the hangar. Harris laughed once, sharp and dismissive. "Sir, this carrier is newer than most of this crew." Old Tim nodded slowly. "The shell is. The thinking isn't." That made Harris pause, but only for a moment. "Look," Harris said, crossing his arms. "We follow the manual. Every step, every checklist. There's nothing left to try." Old Tim stepped away from the railing and approached the engine. Slowly, deliberately. Each step carried the weight of experience. "Manuals are written by people," he said, "and people forget things." One of the engineers muttered, "Like what?" Old Tim crouched near a side panel and ran his fingers across a seam in the metal, almost affectionately. "Like the fact that this system was designed by engineers who didn't trust software alone." Harris frowned. "What does that mean?" "It means," Old Tim replied, standing up, "there's a mechanical safeguard that never shows up on your screen." Silence fell. Harris hesitated. Pride and desperation collided inside him. Finally, he gestured sharply. "You've got 5 minutes." Old Tim smiled, not with triumph, but with understanding. He removed his jacket, folded it neatly, and placed it aside. Then he reached for a small access panel most of the crew hadn't touched. It wasn't highlighted in the diagnostics. It wasn't mentioned in the restart procedure. He listened, not with instruments, with instinct. He placed his ear close to the metal, tapping lightly with his knuckle. "Frozen relay," he said calmly. "Happens when the system shuts down too clean." The engineers stared at him. Too clean. Old Tim reached into his pocket and pulled out a small, worn tool, older than half the crew. He adjusted something gently, almost respectfully. "Systems like this," he said, "sometimes need to be reminded they're alive." He straightened up and nodded. "Try now." Harris hesitated, then signaled. The technician hit the switch. Lights flickered. Screens blinked. A low hum filled the hangar as power surged back through the carrier. Gasps echoed around the room. The engine came alive. Harris stared in stunned silence. Old Tim picked up his jacket. "That's Section 1 complete, Lieutenant," he said softly. And for the first time that day, Harris said nothing. The hangar felt different now. Where there had been tension, there was movement. Screens glowed with fresh data. Engineers spoke again, their voices steady, almost excited. The aircraft carrier systems were coming back online, one subsystem at a time, like a giant waking from a deep sleep. Lieutenant Harris stood still, watching it happen. His confidence had returned, but it was quieter now, controlled, the kind that comes after being humbled. He turned toward Old Tim, who was slipping his arms back into the worn leather jacket. "You knew," Harris said. It wasn't an accusation. It was realization. Old Tim nodded. "I suspected. That relay, it wasn't in the diagnostics." Old Tim gave a small smile. "It wouldn't be. It was built before people trusted screens more than sound." Around them, sailors whispered. Some looked at the old man with newfound respect. Others looked embarrassed. A senior engineer approached. "Sir, how did you know exactly where to check?" Old Tim looked at the massive engine, listening to its steady hum. "Because it didn't sound right before it shut down. Machines talk. You just have to stop staring at the numbers long enough to hear them." Harris exhaled slowly. "We nearly delayed deployment because we missed that." "Almost," Old Tim corrected. "But you didn't. That matters." Harris studied him for a moment. "Why didn't you say anything sooner?" Old Tim met his eyes. "Because no one was listening yet." That answer hit harder than any lecture. The hangar doors opened, letting in a wash of cold air. A message came through Harris's comm unit. Command confirming full system restoration. Relief washed over the crew. A crisis had been avoided. Careers saved. Reputation intact. Harris removed his cap, running a hand through his hair. He walked up to Old Tim and extended his hand. "I owe you an apology," he said. "I underestimated you." Old Tim shook his hand firmly. "Happens more than you think." Harris nodded toward the crew. "Would you stay a little longer? Maybe explain some of the things we don't learn from manuals." Old Tim considered it. Then he nodded. "Only if they ask questions." Harris turned to the crew. "You heard him." Hands went up almost immediately. As Old Tim spoke, his voice calm and steady, the crew gathered closer. He didn't talk about ranks or rules. He talked about mistakes, about early carriers, about failures that taught lessons no classroom ever could. And Harris listened, not as an officer, but as a student. The carrier sailed smoothly through the night, its systems humming in perfect rhythm. On the surface, everything was back to normal. But below deck, something had changed. Lieutenant Harris sat alone in the control room, reviewing system logs he no longer trusted blindly. Every number was perfect, every graph stable. And yet, he couldn't stop thinking about how close they had come to failure. Not because of faulty technology, but because of pride. He replayed the moment Old Tim had touched the relay. So small, so simple. A solution that decades of experience recognized instantly, while years of modern training had overlooked it completely. Later that evening, Harris found Old Tim in the mess area, sipping coffee from a chipped metal mug. "Couldn't sleep?" Old Tim asked without looking up. "No," Harris admitted. He hesitated, then sat down. I keep thinking, what if you hadn't been here? Old Tim took a slow sip. Then you'd have figured it out eventually. Pain teaches fast. Harris nodded. But at what cost? Old Tim met his eyes. That's the question leaders forget to ask. The mess hall was quiet. A few sailors passed by, nodding respectfully at the old man. Word had spread. He was no longer just a consultant. He was a reminder. I was trained to trust the system, Harris said. To believe the data never lies. Old Tim smiled gently. Data doesn't lie, but it doesn't tell the whole truth either. Harris leaned forward. Then what should I trust? Old Tim set the mug down. Patterns, history, people, and your own instincts, after they've been sharpened by failure. The words settled deep. The next morning, Harris did something unusual. He called the crew together, not for a briefing, but for a conversation. We did everything right, Harris told them, and we still almost failed. That should scare us. The room was silent. We need to stop believing that new automatically means better, he continued, and start respecting those who built what we stand on. He gestured toward old Tim, standing quietly at the back. Experience isn't outdated. It's upgraded. For the first time, applause broke out, not loud but sincere. Old Tim didn't smile. He simply nodded. As the carrier pushed forward across open water, Harris watched the horizon. Leadership, he realized, wasn't about knowing everything. It was about knowing who to listen to and when. And somewhere deep inside the ship, an old relay clicked softly, doing its job. By the time the carrier reached open deployment range, old Tim's work was done. He stood on the hangar deck one last time, watching sailors move with confidence and purpose. The same crew that once ignored him now greeted him with respect. Some asked questions. Others simply nodded, understanding that not all gratitude needed words. Lieutenant Harris walked beside him toward the exit ramp. Command wants to offer you an extended contract, Harris said. Training role, advisory position. You'd be shaping the next generation. Old Tim paused. He looked around at the massive ship, the steel walls, the roaring engines, the hum of controlled power. I've already shaped it, he said softly. Harris smiled, though there was sadness in it. Then at least let us do one thing right. He reached into his pocket and handed old Tim a small naval insignia. Newly minted, polished, but bearing the same symbol as the faded one on old Tim's cap. It belongs to you, Harris said. Officially this time. Old Tim studied it for a long moment. Then he nodded. Thank you. As old Tim stepped off the carrier, the sun rose behind him, casting long shadows across the deck. The engines roared to full life, powerful and steady. No hesitation, no doubt. Harris watched from above, saluting as the old man disappeared down the ramp. Weeks later, during a routine systems drill, a junior technician noticed something unusual. Sir, he said, the diagnostics say everything's normal, but something feels off. Harris didn't dismiss him. He listened. They found the issue early, fixed it quietly. No crisis, no panic. That night, Harris wrote a note and placed it in the ship's maintenance log. Not a technical entry, but a reminder. Never confuse new knowledge with complete knowledge. The carrier sailed on, stronger not because of better machines, but because of better leaders. And somewhere far from the ocean, an old man smiled, knowing the lesson had landed. The end.